I should update my academia edu because the book that I was working on is done. So that was the book that I was working on last time I updated my academia edu website. And I'm going to talk to you about two things. So I'm actually first going to talk to you a little bit about what I think of as the three founding fathers of India. So most people just know a lot about Gandhi, but Ambedkar and Tagore are equally important. So I'm going to give you some background on each of them, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about my work. And I have a second PowerPoint, but I think I'm just going to show this first one with the background on India, and then when I get to sort of like my work, I'll just talk to you and forget the second PowerPoint, partly because I'm late, but partly because it's, it's a little nicer to do that. So how many people here have heard of Gandhi? Yes. How many people here have heard of Ambedkar? How many people here have heard of Tagore? Ooh, okay, that's good. Some people heard of Tagore. Okay, so I've done a lot of work on Gandhi as well. I've taught several courses all on Gandhi, and I've been to India several times, which I'll talk about more, but I've been to India 11 times. Most recently, I was there as a Fulbright Fellow, and I lived in India for 3 months. And I stayed in the town where Tagore founded a university, and I was affiliated with that university when I was in India. So I'm going to talk about each of them respectively. They they overlap. I mean, the interesting thing is, and I was trying to find out more about the relationship between Tagore and Ambedkar recently, but I do know that Gandhi and Tagore met and were considered each other good friends, and there's several pictures of them together, although they disagreed about the idea of Indian nationalism. Those of you who know about Gandhi probably know about nonviolence and ahimsa, but you also probably know about him because he is the one who led the independence movement in India, which, got India out from British colonization, and India became a nation. Tagore, as I'll talk about a little bit later, he was more of a cosmopolitan, meaning he felt that we should look globally to our relationships. He really valued cultural diversity, but he actually felt that nationalism imposed arbitrary boundaries around countries and cultures and nations. And then Ambedkar is a fascinating figure. So I knew a little bit about Ambedkar, but when I was living in India on the Fulbright, I joined a study circle, which is virtual, so I've been able to continue it. So I've been in a study circle about Ambedkar for about 1.5 years. Ambedkar was a Dalit. Formerly they were called untouchables, which is it's not the lowest caste, it's actually outside and below the caste system altogether. And Ambedkar led a movement, actually, of Dalits, and he also is one of the writers of the Indian Constitution. And he's the first person in India to get a PhD in economics outside India, which he got at Columbia in the early 1900s. So each of these figures is fascinating in their own right, and all of them played an integral role so the lecture is called, or this talk I'm giving is called The Making of India, right? So how India was made and how each of these figures played a role. So here we have a little bit more about what I just said. So again, most of you know about Gandhi, and so I talked about ahimsa as nonviolence, Swaraj as self-rule or independence. I'm going to talk about each of these things in depth throughout the talk. Ambedkar is most known for his role in writing the Constitution, and then also Dalit liberation and anti-caste activism. So there actually is still a movement in India. Caste has been illegal, so discrimination on the basis of caste has actually been illegal since the 40s, since the Indian Constitution. But there is still caste discrimination. And for those of you that are mostly familiar with the US context, you can think of it about like civil rights laws about racism, right? So we outlawed racism in 1965, but still there's structural racism, and still people are subjected to things like more police violence, et cetera, if they are people of color. Tagore, who was the person I went to India to study on my Fulbright, he is the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his book-length poem called Gitanjali. He also wrote the national anthem of India, so another reason he's a founding father of India is he's the author of the national anthem. And he founded a university called Visva-Bharati, which he founded with his Nobel Prize money. So I always think that's pretty cool. Okay. So Gandhi. There's several concepts. So I don't have ahimsa up there because most people do know ahimsa as nonviolence. He was famous for his movement on nonviolence. One of the things that he did, so there's several things, is that he would go to demonstrations and protests. One of the first times he was in a protest was actually not in India. Gandhi actually lived in South Africa for many years, and the first time he was part of a protest was when South Africa was asking people for identity cards in order to travel, and so there was a very strict racial hierarchy there as well. So just like a very kind of like variegated racial hierarchy, right? So whites were at the top, Indians were somewhere after whites, black people, black Africans were like below that. And everyone had to carry an identity card. And Gandhi rebelled against that, and that happened actually after he got thrown off the train. So I like to tell Gandhi stories. And so he was on a train, and he was in the first class car in South Africa, and he was asked by the conductor to get out of the first class car because he wasn't white, and he said, no, I'm not going to, and then the conductor insisted, and then he said, well, how did you get your ticket? Like, how did a person of color even get a ticket in first class? And Gandhi said, well, I mailed away for it. And then he kept, the conductor kept saying, you've got to, you don't belong here. And Gandhi said, well, I'm a lawyer, and I'm not leaving. I'm not going to stay in the car. And then the conductor said, well, there aren't any lawyers like that. There aren't any Indian lawyers. There aren't any lawyers of color. And Gandhi said, well, sir, you're wrong, because I'm an Indian, and I'm a lawyer. And then he got thrown out at the next train station. But it's what actually catalyzed his activism around racial issues, so in South Africa. So anyway, the first protest he was involved in, people were burning their identity cards as a protest to not having to carry them on trains to identify them as and categorize them by race, right? Because at that point, South Africa was a multiracial country. It had a lot of people from the Indian diaspora. Actually, Durban in South Africa has one of the largest diasporic Indian populations in the world. So ahimsa he was beaten actually in South Africa, and he didn't fight back, and he was beaten quite badly. And he was also thrown in prison a few times in South Africa. I mean, he was also thrown in prison in India, but we'll get to that. So his ahimsa was something that he felt was an effective political stance, because he felt like if you fought back, it just fueled the flames of violence. Right, that violence begets more violence, and it was in his life at every level. Right, so he was a person who meditated. He ran and lived in an ashram both in South Africa and then when he moved to India, and he believed in nonviolence. He was a vegetarian. He was a very gentle person. So he believed in it at the personal level, the interpersonal level, but also the social and political level. And this is what he's so famous for, because in India, in the national movement, he used nonviolence to make his point. Sometimes he would fast, right? Anyone have heard about Gandhi's fast? So his fasts were very important. That's one way of being nonviolent. He also took people on marches. The British put a large tax on salt. India can be very hot. You need salt to live. You have to have salt in your diet in order to survive the high temperatures. People couldn't afford the salt, so he led the famous Salt March. He led people on an over 100-mile march. So he did various things, but all of the things that he did, none of them involved fighting back or picking up weapons, and like I said, he was jailed several times in his life. So ahimsa. Then there's Swaraj. Swaraj, as I said, is self-rule or self-government, but it's more than that, because Swaraj involves, it's related to Swadeshi, but Swaraj involves sort of being independent. So one example of that is he's also very famous. There's a lot of pictures of Gandhi with a spinning wheel, right? So he's also very famous for his spinning wheel, where he for a spinning wheel, where he would make his own cotton and cotton cloth, and he encouraged all Indians to make their own cotton cloth. It's called khadi cloth. It's homespun cloth with the cotton from India, because what had happened was when the British came and colonized India, they took over the textile mills, and also they started importing fabrics that weren't cotton. They weren't natural fabrics. And so again, a lot of India was agrarian at the time, and people it wasn't like fully a cash economy, and people didn't have the cash to, buy clothes from the outside, especially clothes that, might not have been suited for the climate, because cotton actually breathes better in hot climates and other things. So Swadeshi, so Swaraj is self-rule. It's mostly related to national independence. Swadeshi means of one's own country, right? So that's why the khadi cloth is very important. It became the symbol of the Swadeshi movement, and the spinning wheel is also still the symbol of the Swadeshi movement. And there are still places in India where khadi cloth is made, and there's Gandhi founded a university in Gujarat, in the state of Gujarat, and one of the things every student has to do is to learn how to spin. And when they spin their own. So here he's spinning the threads for the cotton. So first you spin the threads, and then you hand loom the cotton into fabric, and then of course you stitch, you cut it and stitch it. So Swadeshi. Ahimsa we already talked about. The slides are not in the same order of my notes. All right, two more quick things. There's also, one more quick thing. There's also satyagraha. So satyagraha is truth force or soul force, and he mostly combined his idea of satyagraha with his nonviolence. So for him, the nonviolence was an active resistance to oppression and to colonization. It wasn't just sort of like laying down and rolling over, right? So he made a big distinction between active nonviolence and passive nonviolence, and he believed in active nonviolence, right? So the protests, the fasts, and all the other things he did. Okay, so that's a little bit about Gandhi. Also, I tend to talk fast, so am I going too fast? Okay, so now Ambedkar, who is a fascinating figure that I think that people don't know enough about. So that's his full name, Bhimrao Raji Ambedkar. He was given a nickname later, actually after he died, which is Baba Sahib, which means, the great one, or father. And so Ambedkar is most well known for his work on caste and untouchability. He, like I said, he was the first person to get a PhD in economics, first in India. He actually went to Columbia at the age of 22. He got a big scholarship from the Indian government, so it was 1913. So imagine, right? You're still sort of like going over, this in a boat or whatever. And then he actually met Dewey. So when he was at Columbia, he met John Dewey. He went on to go, he actually also studied at the London School of Economics. But in his own country, right, he was an untouchable. Okay, so at this time, this is before independence, the caste system is very strong. And Dalits, so untouchability is usually not used in India anymore. Dalit is the preferred term. So Dalits were, rejected. And just so you know a little bit maybe about the caste system, so the higher caste, the Brahmins, usually have professional occupations like usually priests, but also maybe at this point like teachers, doctors, lawyers, right? So sort of like white collar professional occupations. Then you have the next caste, which is merchants or traders, so people who own small businesses. Then you have warriors, the warrior class, so those are people who have military occupations or police force, things like that. And then you have Shudras, which are the laborer caste, which are people who are doing, construction, maybe garbage collection, all sorts of manual labor jobs. And the thing about caste in India is that it's related to heredity and it's related to occupation, and there was not a lot of mobility at this time, and it's partly encoded in Hinduism itself, right? So this is partly in the Vedic texts and the other texts, and I've been, like I said, in the study group on Ambedkar since April of 2002, and we've read quite a few things. One of the first things was a letter, an exchange between he and Gandhi arguing about caste, but now we're reading this really big book called Riddles of Hinduism, where he takes the Vedic texts and he goes through the Vedic texts and he talks about how these texts are wrong about caste and how people should be treated. But it's a pretty serious thing because India is primarily Hindu. I didn't look up the number today, but it's over 90% Hindu. It's actually an amazingly religiously diverse country. So it's Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Jains, Buddhists, but it is primarily Hindu, and also it's the largest Hindu country in the world. So for embedded